For many of us, it is the most important commitment to take care of our loved ones. We feed, as the Beatles song goes, and we work hard to ensure that those close to us are thriving. Today, there are 53 million people taking care of their parents, neighbors, and friends. And there are 53 million stories. From the Stanford Center on Longevity, this is When I'm 64, the podcast for caregivers. I'm your host, Ken Stern. There's something that most of us need right now, and that's a good laugh. Today on the podcast, we're going to look at caregiving and the power of humor.
So I turned 80 a few months ago, and people are saying the weirdest things to me, like, oh, you're 80? You're almost dead. Are you afraid? I'm like, no, I'm not afraid. My mother made it to 101. And if you want to know the family secret, we don't die. No, we keep shrinking till we just disappear. So I went to visit my mother in the nursing home. You know the problem when you go to a nursing home and you look like me? Yeah, they wouldn't let me out. The only reason I'm here tonight is I had to get a night pass from the front desk.
Comedian Marty Ross. Marty is a stand-up comic who lives in LA. He is also a regular with Laughter on Call, an organization run by DANI MODISETT. Why did she hire Marty Ross? Let's let her explain.
He is a Laughter on Call favorite because people feel like he talks directly to them from where they are, and it's so compelling, and he's so clever and warm and honest. And I always love having Marty Ross around. I bring him everywhere I can.
DANI MODISETT started Laughter on Call when she noticed that her elderly mother was losing her memory, but not her sense of humor. Here's Dani's story.
I would say I'm all about using laughter to create connections with people. And that would be like the through line of my life. If you looked at my whole life, it would be about trying to get people to laugh so that I could feel connected to them, and also so that they could feel connected to each other and feel better about wherever they are. I was born in New York City, and then we moved to Westport, Connecticut when I was about 10. And that is actually relevant to the laughter piece. I was thinking about this because when we moved, it was a big upheaval for the family. And particularly my mother, who had lived on the island of Manhattan her whole life. And now she was living in suburban Connecticut. She was very angry. There was a lot of tension at the dinner table. I just remember I had a sister. I still have a sister, God bless her. And so the four of us would be at the table at dinner, and it'd be very quiet because like we had basically moved into a summer house. I know these are all luxury problems, but this was the times that they were. We had this small little cottage, truly, and we were all living there, and my father changed his business. Anyway, everybody was very upset. And I had made these ceramic finger puppets. I was 10. And I had made ceramic finger puppets, and I just remember one night like getting up from the table and bringing these ceramic finger puppets and then doing voices and like, oh, this is so sad. I know, Mom's really upset. I know, what are we gonna do? And so, that was my instinct to try to break the tension at the table. And I think, it's like, I feel like some people are just born comedians. It's not, and some people either do it professionally or they don't, but the impulse to break tension with laughter, to try to get people to laugh and bring some joy to a dark moment is something you either have that instinct to do that, or maybe it's born of pain, and so that's how you process pain. So I think that's in terms of like a lifetime. But anyway, so then I was a theater major. I went to Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, and I was a theater major, which was an odd choice for Dartmouth, but I I had a wonderful time there. I met this director, Jerry Zaks, also a comedy person. He directs a lot of Broadway, and it was all about comedy and the precision of comedy. So I would say it was embedded in me, kind of the rules of comedy and escalation and all of that. The technique of comedy was really kind of drilled into me in those years. And then I wanted to be a performer. I really couldn't be an assistant. I outgrew it. I had to go to I need an audience, I guess, is the bottom line. So I came to Los Angeles, and I knew very few people, and I started doing some television, and you sit in a trailer a lot, and I was restless. So I took a class at UCLA in stand-up comedy. because people kept telling me, oh, you're so funny, you're so funny. I was waiting tables. I didn't know I was funny. I was mostly angry, but they said you're really funny. So I took this class, and the teacher was Shelley Bonus. She was Richard Pryor's ex-wife. Very, very funny, smart woman, very dry. And she took me aside after the first class, and she said, you know, you're a comedian. You may never do it, but you're a comedian. Like, I know that I can, you know, that's how you see the world. And so then I started doing stand-up and toured, and then went back and taught that class 10 years later. And that's when my mother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. So I moved my mother to LA, and we landed, I found a place called Silverado Beverly Place, which is in the heart of Los Angeles. And then within about, I would say like a month, she became depressed. She clearly was cognizant of the fact that she was not in her home and she wasn't going to her home. She might not have known that she wasn't going to her home, but something was not right. And she was withdrawn and not eating very much. And I was really feeling bad and really feeling like I'd made a mistake. And I was at my dentist, and, you know, because it's LA, she's like a life coach. And she said, and I said, I just don't know. I just, you know, I can't. My mother's so unhappy. I don't know what to do. I feel terrible. I just wish I could hire a comedian to cheer her up. And she was like, oh, well, why don't you do that? That's a good idea. You should go do that. And I was like, I don't know. Can you do that? Like, and so I said, all right, okay. So I went home and I put on Facebook, looking for comedian interested in gerontology, paid gig. I thought, I want people to respond. And so my phone rang a few minutes later, and it was a comedian friend of mine in New York. And she said, oh my God, I just got off the phone with someone in LA who wants to work with seniors. She's like sitting on park benches. Like, you should call her. So I called her. She came over, and she came up to my mother and really did all these things that we know now that are so effective, but just on instinct. She got eye level with her. She looked her in the eyes. She talked directly to her, and she spoke honestly. And it helped that she had like a little New York accent. Like, that was very familiar to my mother too. And she said, I know. You don't want to talk to me. No, you're probably thinking, who is this schmuck just talking and talking? And there was something about the word schmuck that just like, it was like a light bulb went on, and my mother just lit up and started laughing. And I hadn't seen that in months. And it was so beautiful, and like, oh my God, here it is. Like, she's laughing. So I saw a comedian making my mother laugh, and I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, oh my God, this should be everywhere. This should be everywhere, because there's always comedians who need to make money, and there's an endless and ever-growing population of people who need this specific kind of attention. And then I wrote an article about the experience for AARP magazine. And the article, I got hundreds of responses from the article saying, please can you bring a comedian to Wichita? I need a comedian in Pittsburgh. Please come to Florida. Please, please, please. And I was like, okay, well, how can I not do this? Like, I have to do this. And then what happened was I was going to residential communities to talk about this one-on-one opportunity for families. And the executive directors started asking me for more. They were like, okay, great, but can you train my caregivers to communicate in a way that will make people laugh? Like, can you come up with a workshop? And can you also do that workshop for families so that you can help families with that? And because I had taught at UCLA, I had a whole curriculum. I had a whole comedy curriculum, and that's what I also have been teaching, you know, during this time too. So we get all of the whole staff there, everyone from the kitchen to the people, the caregivers, and we go through this acronym and talk about these different steps, and they get to learn about each other, so it creates community for the workers, and also gives them some insight in how to deal with each other and to deal with the people that they have to care for, and the families, because there's tension everywhere. So yeah, we have like probably 50 comedians. They don't work all the time, and COVID's been a whole other trip. So we've actually pivoted to Zoom. We do everything virtually right now because we can't get in person. So we're doing FaceTime meetings, and we were doing interactive storytelling, which is one of the services where we were going in person and engaging the whole room in improv storytelling, where they give the suggestions and the comedians build the story based on what they say, no matter what it is. Super fun. I know it sounds crazy, but the whole idea is to get engagement, is to have them know that they're being seen and heard and engaged with. And, you know, I often say, like, I couldn't call the company cognitive engagement on call, because, like, that's not funny. Nobody wants that. But that's really the goal. Like, the laughter is fantastic, and obviously that's what we're going for. But in a lot of cases, just getting someone to connect with you and to feel seen is a victory and feels great. I like that as an example of, like, there's so many people who don't feel seen, and there's so many problems with people not knowing that, like, you can't talk about like, they're there. You know, there's this prevailing sentiment with Alzheimer's that, oh, they're gone. I'm not going, they're gone, they're gone. And that's not our experience. Like, they're not gone. You just have to find the way in. And so that's what, you know, that's what we love about it, is it's like having, like, you know, comedians, you'll have 5,000 people laughing, but, like, one person in the front row with a scowl, and you're like, why isn't that person laughing? It's like having that person, like, you're trying to crack it. Like, well, how can we get in there? And you can do it with music or pictures or dance, or, you know, that's what we're constantly exploring. So people often have asked me, you know, how did you even think, like, laughter in it's the darkest place? And it was actually because of Caregivers that I thought, oh, you know, because comedy takes courage to stand in front of people. And what I observed about caregivers through this process is how much courage it takes. Like, it's not your average person that can show up for a disease like this. And so I really salute that the courage of being a caregiver. And something else that people have asked me is, well, you know, when they don't have language, like, how can you make them laugh? How do you do it? And it's been such a wonderful lesson to know that you don't need language. You can, you know, there were times with my mother, certainly for a year, she didn't speak toward the last year. But if you shake your head a certain way, or sing a song, or look them in the eye and just make a funny face, they can mirror back. They can read your face, and they can mirror back what you're doing. And then you'll have that moment that is precious if you have the courage to show up for it. It is remarkable, and it is an example of how they really are still there. You just have to be a little creative about the approach. You can't rely on language. It's a little bit more about physicality and voice and dance and all those, you know, kind of out of the box ways of communicating, and you really can make a difference. So that's what we encourage people to do.
That's DANI Klein-Modisett, founder of Laughter on Call. We wanted to further explore the importance of humor in caregiving relationships, so we brought in two experts. CHRISTINA Irving is the Clinical Services Director and Family Consultant at Family Caregivers Alliance, and Barry Jacobs is a clinical psychologist, family therapist, and author of the book AARP's Meditation for Caregivers. I asked both Barry and CHRISTINA, what is it about humor and laughter that draws us together?
It joins us in mirth, you know, it joins us in this moment of sheer pleasure, and that we're both in on the joke, you know, and we have this kind of shared understanding, and that's a moment of connection. And yes, it does. We're not thinking about dementia at the moment. We're in that moment with that humorous instinct.
And I think it is about really being present in the moment, and that can be hard for caregivers to do. They're often worried about what's going to happen next, what else could go wrong, maybe thinking about all the things that they need to get done. And when you have that moment of humor, you're really present in that particular moment. And it's harder to worry about all the what ifs and what's to come and everything else you need to do when you're really centered in that moment and enjoying it. So it can be a little meditation in some ways for a caregiver. And I think especially with dementia, you know, we talk so much about dementia communication as joining in the reality of that person. And so it's a similar idea that you're really trying to be present with them in the moment, whatever that moment is, whether it always makes sense to you or it doesn't. But how do you be together right then?
Barry Jacobs, you've written several books about caregiving. What brought you to the subject, and why is it so important to you?
Well, Ken, I grew up in a family where my dad had brain cancer while I was a teenager. It was not funny, and he was quite impaired, and as a consequence, my family went through a very difficult time, both during his illness and then after he died. But it gave me a very strong sense early on about how serious illness, chronic illness are family affairs. They don't simply happen to individuals. They happen to everyone involved in the household. My family really didn't handle caregiving well. And so from the age of 15 on, I pretty much had a sense that I'd want to grow up one day to help families do a better job with caregiving than my own family did. And then, in the subsequent years, I've had other family caregiving experiences, including caring for my mom with vascular dementia and caring for my stepdad with Alzheimer's disease.
So you wrote a book, your most recent book is Meditations for Caregivers. Are there any of the stories from your book that speak to you of caregivers and maybe relate to the topic of the importance of humor in creating relationships with a family member, or maybe even helping people keep their own sanity during the course of caregiving?
Sure, I'll tell you what was a fairly tragic story, which ended up being somewhat humorous. My stepfather, who had Alzheimer's disease, was hospitalized for, I believe, a bladder infection, and then went to a nursing home to do a short stint of rehab afterwards. Well, he had no idea where he was. He was very confused, and so he literally, quote unquote, eloped from the nursing home. He went out he snuck out of the building and was in the parking lot. The nursing home called the police, who showed up with their police sirens blaring, and pulled into the parking lot. And my stepfather, it was an old Korean War veteran, and he decided he was going to fight them. And so they got him to the emergency room, where he was very combative. And then I wasn't there. I was out of town that day, so my wife had the responsibility of going to the to the emergency room. And she took one look at him, and he was sort of like cornered like a beast and very fearful, but really angry at everyone around him. And she just went up and said, "Steve, how are you? Good to see you." And Steve's whole demeanor completely changed and said, "Oh, good to see you too." And he immediately dropped all of his confusion, his delusions, his combativeness. And within about 30 seconds, my wife had completely calmed him down. That's a story we still tell years later after my stepfather died, because I think it's a very telling lesson that sometimes if we approach people with a little bit of lightheartedness and engage them on that level, then we're not taking an adversarial position with them. We're not coming at them as police were with practically with guns drawn to try to get him to behave better. So that's a story that's in our book.
So, Christina Irving, does that story from Barry Jacobs remind you of some of the challenges and stories you've heard from your work at the Family Caregivers Alliance?
Absolutely. I think we talk with caregivers every day. We provide this very comprehensive package of services for caregivers, and so assessment and care planning and support. And so we hear these stories, and caregivers have to figure out, how do I deal with it? And some people are going to innately know how to respond to somebody with dementia and be able to really join them in that moment and come at those really difficult and challenging situations with a very positive perspective and attitude. Others, it's a learning process to not kind of take in that situation just described, not take in that worry and that fear and that chaos that might be happening in the environment and not respond with that, but figure out, how do I respond in a way that this person with dementia is going to react more positively to? And I think that's can be a skill, and it's a challenge sometimes for caregivers to learn how to do that, because they're coping with their own stresses and worries and fears related to caregiving.
We've been talking a little about the importance and value of humor and in terms of engaging with a loved one. But what about humor for caregivers themselves? We know it's often a stressful complicated, difficult time for caregivers as well as their loved ones. Have you seen what's the importance of humor for caregivers as opposed to for their loved ones?
It can be a great coping mechanism for caregivers to be able to see the humor in a situation and not just see the sadness or the difficulty. It's something that helps people get through those challenging times. And I don't think everybody is always at the same place in terms of being able to see the humor in their life and in their circumstances. I know there are some clients who have gone to support groups and seen other caregivers talk about the scenarios that Barry and I have just mentioned and be able to laugh about it. And some of these caregivers will say, I can't do that. I don't find that funny right now. And that's understandable. And I think we need to allow that space for people to be at different parts of their journey. But I think when caregivers can get to the place that they can either see some of the humor or the lightness or the positivity of their caregiving circumstances, it helps them not just dwell on the things that they've lost, on the changes in their life. Because most caregivers don't really plan for this. This is not what they expected to be doing at any particular stage of life. And so there's a lot of grief and loss that comes with it. And that's real, and that needs to be kind of addressed and responded to, not just stuffed down and pretend it's not there. But I think when people can find the humor and joy in their life, despite all these challenges, it can make the day a little bit easier because they're not just focused on the things that are hard. And we know all the stress hormones that people experience with chronic stress and the impact that can have on somebody's physical and mental health, and the endorphins that you get from laughing and humor and joy can help kind of counter that and help people manage their both physical and their emotional health as well.
What I always talk with my caregiver clients about is that they have to still find the sweetness in living. That it can't, the caregiving often goes on for years. No one can live without some level of enjoyment. Every day should have some moments of sweetness, maybe some moments of connection with the person you're caring for, or connections with others. But other than that, just enjoyment, just feeling the breeze, or drinking the coffee and enjoying it, or reading a funny book or watching a funny video. I mean, those moments of sweetness really carry us over some rough times.
We heard earlier from DANI KLEIN MODISETT, who talked to us about how she used humor to connect with her mother who has Alzheimer's. And DANI went on to start her own company, Laughter on Call, that brings comedians to those who need them the most. We often think of Alzheimer's and dementia as perhaps the least funny of all diseases. Is there special challenges and opportunities, Christina Irving, about using humor with those with Alzheimer's and dementia?
I think you're right. It's not something that always on the surface appears like it's funny. You're seeing losses and changes in somebody's abilities, in their ability to communicate, their ability to remember, to be able to manage basic daily activities independently. And there's a lot of sadness, a lot of anger and frustration that can come with that for caregivers, both to see it in somebody that they care about, and also what it means for how it's impacted their own life. And a lot of people experience grief and loss as they go through this journey of caregiving. They grieve for what the other person has lost. They grieve for the changes in their own relationship with that person, for what they thought their own future would look like. And so it's hard to sometimes see the humor in those situations. It's not something that everybody is going to come to at the same time. And I think some caregivers won't be able to. They're not going to necessarily be able to see the humor in dementia or in Alzheimer's or in the circumstances that they find themselves in. And I think we have to allow that space for that. Everybody's going to cope with this and process with it in their own way. For those caregivers, they may have to find other sources of joy and humor in their life. It may not come from caregiving, doesn't mean that you can't still find it somewhere. But I think, for those who can recognize the way reality can change for someone with dementia and can see humor and lightness in that, I think it can make their own journey a little bit lighter when they can see that here's somebody who is actually, despite dementia, maybe enjoying their life, finding fun in different circumstances, and you can find fun with them. it can make it feel a little less of a burden and more of a circumstance where this is not what we planned, this is not how we thought things were going to go, but okay, this is what we have right now. And there are times where what we have is going to be sad, and there's times that what we have is going to be kind of funny and maybe a little ridiculous. But can we find and enjoy that humor? But everyone's going to go through this process a little differently, depending on their own history and their own relationship with the person that they're caring for. So it's really having to allow people to figure out what's going to work best for them.
Yeah, years ago, I worked as a psychologist on a brain injury unit in a rehab hospital. And there was a woman there who had flipped her car. She'd been driving like a Mazda Miata, an old sports car, and she had flipped it. She had a pretty serious brain injury, and that in of itself was not funny. But we had a family meeting, the whole team there. Her husband was there, she was there. And she was complaining to the team and to the husband that nobody here seemed to understand her, that we really weren't respecting her. And she was making all kinds of fairly serious claims. And I said to her, what is it that's important about you that you would like all of us to understand? And there was like a pause. And then she said, I really enjoy a light pink Chablis with brie cheese. And it was like, everybody in the room sort of like did this double take, like, what are you talking about? But it was also, and it was, on the one hand, it was hilarious. It was sort of like, it came out of left field. On the other hand, it was a very appropriate response. And in essence, she was basically saying, I'm a person and these are the things that I enjoy. It was sad that she was as confused as she was to have answered in that manner, which seems so kind of outlandish at the moment. But there was this one aspect of it which everyone sort of couldn't help but to laugh. It was just so strange. So I'm not suggesting we make fun of people who have cognitive deficits. I am suggesting that sometimes cognitive deficits, in and of themselves, they tell truths which are odd, and they come out of things from a different direction, and that's what humor does. Humor kind of misdirects us. It kind of sets us up to assume one thing, and then it kind of undercuts that assumption with another thing. That's what Sigmund Freud wrote about humor 100 years ago. That's what she did with her comment. And so I think even with folks with Alzheimer's dementia or any other cognitive issue, there may be some humor that people can appreciate.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to end the interview with the idea that humor is connecting with people from a different direction. I think that's a very nice thought. Barry Jacobs is a clinical psychologist, family therapist, and author of the book AARP's Meditation for Caregivers. And Christina Irving is the clinical services director and family consultant at Family Caregivers Alliance. You can find out more about us by visiting our website, longevity.stanford.edu. Today's show was produced by Carrie Thompson, with production assistance from Sage Bierman and Ellie Wartell. And leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. You've been listening to When I'm 64, the podcast for caregivers. Thanks for joining us. I'm Ken Stern.